Welcome to Asperger's Heroes. We're talking a bit about diagnosis and interviewing David on his late diagnosis of Asperger's. David, can you tell us a bit about what it was that led you to suspect you were autistic?
Yeah, looking back, I'd always felt I was slightly different. I was in maybe, that this feeling of being special that I've heard a number of people talk about. I certainly had that. I'd studied psychology, so I ought to have known something about autism and so on, which I did, but that never clicked, and I never made the link with that. I was a very deep thinker. I just thought I was introverted and, had difficulty socializing and had to make an effort, and really did make an effort in socializing. So I think it was not long after we got married, or a few years after we got married, that I think the combination of, can we say, external factors and internal factors. I think there was externally, it was due to how we got on this. It was to do with our relationship and why I found some of the communication with you difficult. I'd always found communication with my mum difficult, and I assumed very arrogantly that it was her fault, and blamed a lot of my problems on my mum and my upbringing, which I've later come to regret. I think some of the challenges that we had in communicating, I think it was you, Nets, that mentioned that you seem a little bit on the autistic spectrum, because you worked with people, you worked with clients that were autistic. And so I began to look that up and thought, oh yeah, that's sort of my personality. And that is I am a little bit like that. But that grew and that grew. And some of it was wanting to understand. I began reflecting on my own behavior. I wanted to understand myself. I knew I was introverted, but it wasn't just that. I knew my heart was good and that I wasn't bad-tempered and manipulative, even though sometimes I came over as that. I knew that wasn't right. And sometimes I'd reflect, maybe it seemed too much on what happened. And I'd try to work out when we'd, sometimes I'd have what I'd know now is a meltdown. I'd just feel frustrated at something. I'd seem to lose my temper. I'd be very upset about something that seemed really trivial and seemed really, didn't quite make sense. And I think you'd echo that, wouldn't you, Nets? Those things didn't quite make sense in our discussions. So I began reading more about autism. And one of the things that I began looking at was a book, the Asperger's Couples Workbook. And we actually began to work through it. This was before I'd, even gone for diagnosis or just suspecting that I was diagnosed, that I was could be diagnosed autistic. And we began working through that and found some of the strategies helpful. There was a point I remember when I was, one, we'd worked through that. One, I was quite, we still had some of the conflicts that we had. And I remember you saying you wanted to go and talk to another couple that you knew, and if you like, dragged me over there, and And I just said to them, I think I'm autistic. And I don't know what you expected me to say, Des. I think you expected me to say, oh, we've got these problems in our marriage or something like that. But I didn't. I went, I think I'm autistic, because it wasn't problem. It wasn't what it appeared to be. I knew it was deeper in that. And that was the beginning, I think, of making steps towards getting a diagnosis.
One of the things that I would just say there is that very often, or that there would be times when an argument would start, and Dave, as he said, would reflect and reflect and reflect. But I would say, no, it didn't start at that point. It started a lot longer before that. And it had started at a point where Dave had said something in a tone of voice that I had totally misinterpreted.
Yeah.
And the number of times I suggested that Dave go to drama classes to learn,
because I had no understanding of
before we knew what it was all about.
Yeah.
But that was a big thing. It was misinterpreting Dave's tone of voice a lot of the time, when he wasn't even aware that he was doing anything in any particular tone of voice. So that was,
yeah. And I get upset about something, and I wouldn't remember the earlier bit. I wouldn't remember what happened that led up to that. I don't know if that was I still don't fully understand that. I think it was blocking my memory somehow because of the overload that was happening.
So
yeah.
So David, can you tell us a bit about actually asking the doctor for a referral and what happened there?
Yeah, I do think it's funny that there are certain guardians, if you like, that to the autistic community, and I still find that a bit jarring. And the way that you can get a professional psychiatrist, certainly on the NHS, is to get a referral from a GP. Now, there is guidance on. I looked a lot at the guidance on the National Autistic Society's website about going for a diagnosis. Just to say, these are classed as very late diagnoses, because just one of the things is I was in my 50s, so I've lived a whole life undiagnosed of this, or not a whole lot, but decades. So going for very late diagnosis, there's lots of I looked up what the diagnostic criteria would be, what sort of questions I would be asked and needed to provide information on. And there are lots of things that you need to look at, such not just what we've just described in communication, but also in sensitivities, in how you get on with people, how your thinking happens, your focus in your thinking, and how I had problems changing that focus, and how that could be quite frustrating. So looking at all these different criteria and all these different questions that cover a wide range of things, I began to prepare something. And I realized after some time looking at these and writing, that I'd written, almost an essay on it, not quite an essay, but I'd written a lot. So I put these together in a letter, 2 sides of A4 that I could bring with me to the doctor. So I was really prepared. They're all deficits. They're all quite negative. And the way it's designed is you say, I've got this deficit, I've got this problem. And doing that, I think, was important for me to have that sense of I'm in control, because I was asking the diagnosis. I think an important question in this is, why do you want a diagnosis? And I just had to know. And you might say, well, why do you want another label? There isn't anything we can do for you, and all those things. But I was prepared for that, and thinking about that, and saying, and and that was some of the things I'd written down, I think, in the letter, were things like, I just want to gain understanding of myself, and so I wrote down those in a sense of being prepared and being in control. Next, you came with me, didn't you, to the GP, and I think that's important, because at first, when I'd done that, I'd written a letter. I went through some of the points on the letter, or maybe all of them, I can't really remember. But at first, I remember he said no. And so I said, and there was something in my response, because I think I was quite angry at that moment that he said no, that was the clincher, really. And he saw, I think, in the way I responded to that shock, that he didn't think, he said something like, I don't think you're autistic. And I can't remember how I think the way I said, I think I am, and the way I was suddenly provoked in that. It might just be, oh, he backed down, but it might be he saw something autistic in that response, I think. And yeah, that clinched it. So he made a referral, and he he said okay, and made a referral, and we came out of that going, we've got that, and made another step on the way. There was a sense of being very in control when I went in, and needing that, and feeling out of control when he said no.
Having said that, I wouldn't recommend going towards meltdown when you're in the GP surgery.
No.
That is not yeah, it doesn't make you, yeah. That there are a lot of sort of general societal norms that people are expected to adhere to, like not not getting, I wouldn't say angry, because it wasn't even angry, was it? It was just a
frustration, a shock and a frustration. Yeah, but that wasn't something that was planned. I felt very, as you say, you don't recommend doing that. I'm just saying that was my response.
Yes, that's
but
right.
I think there was something in that. What I'd prepared was all these things from the, which I think are important, are, things about my friendships and relationships, things about my sensory difficulties, my, that I'd found social interaction difficult, and my need for routine. And I talked about, I'd written things about that I follow routines, or my focus, that when I break that focus, when I'm distracted, or that's when you interrupt me. And that's one of the things, linking back into your other question, when I'm interrupted, it's very frustrating. And in work, I'd never, or I'd worked part-time for a lot of time. And I think that was, because I got really fatigued, and that wasn't what I got, a part-time job, and I was happy with the part-time job, and I felt I would be too worn out doing something that was more full-time, whereas a lot of people would be pushing towards getting something full-time and getting more responsibility and so on. It could be.
I think there is a certain people, one of the things that has come up in the past is that people are often referred, people with particular presentations and are often referred to mental health services first. And I always assumed that that was because there are a lot of issues like anxiety and such like that can present as if they might be a mental health problem, and that was a mistake. But we were told very recently that if a GP suspected that somebody had autism, the track in our area is that they have to go to mental health services first. And then once mental health services has said, well, we can only do a certain amount, we think this person has got autism, then they can go on and refer for an autism.
Yeah, and that might have changed since I
might have
was
changed.
diagnosed, because that didn't
Yeah.
happen to me. Yeah.
But that was from a GP, so that was a bit.
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Yes, and it's still this jarring fact that the gatekeeper is a psychiatrist, is, referred to by a GP to a psychiatrist. It's the medical model is the gatekeeper to being autistic. And you can self-identify, but often, the reason that I wanted that was I wanted somebody to tell me that I was autistic, and it's that sense of having to know. I want to know. I want that sense of certainty that you have.
Yeah. So after going to the GP and the agreement that he would refer you, what was the actual assessment process like?
Yeah. So I only had to wait a few months, but this was back in was it 2014, I think. So waited a few months from the referral, getting a assessment September, October, so getting it in the autumn. I mean, asked for the referral in the spring, which seemed long enough for me. Now people are waiting years for something like this. So and I think one of the things that he needed, and which I did, I think, this is important. The reason I had that long letter was that the GP had to apply for funding to get the referral. So he had to fill something in. And so he said, I'll use this letter. This was very helpful to apply for the funding to arrange the referral. So I received the referral, I said later in the year, and it was a psychiatrist, and it was all one. It was based around one appointment. I've been with I've supported people through assessments, and I think quite often today people get a couple of assessments, but this was all done in one sitting, if you like. And so went in with Nets again, and basically she went through some questions which I think now, looking at the actual diagnosis I received, look to be the AQ 50 questions. The AQ 50 is was actually designed for research purposes and not for diagnostic purposes, but it does give a good place to start a discussion on the criteria that they would want for an autism assessment. Although the diagnostic criteria, we still call ourselves Asperger. My diagnosis is Asperger's syndrome, and we call ourselves Asperger's heroes. Diagnostic criteria means most people get a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. That diagnosis now includes what was classic autism and what was Asperger's syndrome. And so everyone identifies as autistic within that. And so that's why I use the terms quite interchangeably. I lived with undiagnosed autism. I was autistic. I received a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, a condition on the autistic spectrum. And I might say I am autistic, but that's different from what was classically called autism. So she went through those questions. Again, I think there's that feeling of, you know, I felt a lot less in control in this setting. I'd felt all prepared beforehand, but I'd done all that preparation beforehand. And she had the letter. She had the letter that I'd given to the GP that had been passed on, and she referred to some of that as well, which was good. I think I began, being treated like this. I felt I was sort of being puzzled over, and where does he fit in? Is he, and I could feel this, the eyes on me looking at me. Am I autistic or not? I was surprised at some of the questions, and I began to talk about my own thoughts and my own, because some of the questions, particularly about the change in focus and the intrusive thoughts that I might have had, meaning thoughts that, the same sort of things over and over again that I might think of. So, and special interests. I talked a bit about a special interest with Doctor Who, for example, and how some of the phrases from that I would keep repeating to myself. And so I had an interview. Oh yeah, and one of the things that is part of the criteria is that they want to know that you've always had this. And it's all geared up to, younger people, because ideally she would have wanted like a parent or teacher there. But, this was after my mum had died a few years ago. And so I told her about my mum. I told stories about my mum. And some of the stories I told made her think she was probably autistic as well. And things like, and interestingly, when I was first spoke, or stories I was told by my mum when I first spoke, that I spoke a full sentence, that I was very late in speaking and then I spoke a full sentence. So things like that were, there's no verification of that. That's a story I remember my mum telling me. But she seemed quite happy with that. But the verification she needed, I think, which was to me quite a shocking experience, which I don't know if you realise this, that is I had to go out and sit on the plastic chairs outside while she talked to you. And so I told my story, I told all these things, and then she talked to you. And I felt completely out of control. I thought, oh, I'm blown now. She'll say, oh, it's not, what he's saying is he's making this up. And, he'll find the truth from that. But I came back in and feeling very emotionally vulnerable and very, I think being outside was the most emotionally vulnerable moment that I had in that. And you're talking about me and I have no idea what you were saying. And that's because you needed somebody to corroborate what I said. And you were the only person really available. And you'd known me how many years at that point? 10 years? I can't remember. 14 years, something like that. But not from childhood. And yeah, and one of the things that she then said was, very clear case of Asperger's syndrome. Oh, is that it? Yes, it's a very clear case of Asperger's syndrome. And that was the fact, I think she said, very clear case. I found it very almost devastating. Like, I thought maybe she'd say, oh, we don't, it's very mild, sort of, you're on the autistic spectrum, and very mild, or I don't know if there's such terms, and if that makes much sense. But she said, no, very clear case. And they sent me a document afterwards that I've got to this day with my diagnosis, pointing out some of the things from my own letter, some of the things that have come up in the conversation like that we've talked about. Yeah. So that was
you touched on the next question a little bit, but what emotional impact did the diagnosis have on you?
Yeah, just to say, some people have different sorts of questions and different. I know someone that's actually had like a puzzle to do and looked at how they approach it. So there's lots of different ways in which people are assessed in that process. So it's not just they ask the questions about those the AQ50, but I think that was just a starting point anyway, because she also went into my past and so on. But yeah, you're saying the emotional. So can you read the question again next?
What emotional impact did the diagnosis have on you?
I think initially it was very much that, because I think I was very vulnerable at the time. So initially there's that sense of losing my identity. Who am I then? I've been living all these years with not known as autistic. This is not me. This is somebody else. Surely this is somebody else. There was a panic. It felt quite distressing at that moment. I think I only caught up with some of these feelings afterwards and just sort of felt them and didn't have the insight for them. But it was this real sense of unreality, a real sense of losing it and going, this can't be happening. What have I done? I've opened up a Pandora's box, of all these things. Why have I, and then, why have I done this? And those sort of that's the initial feelings that were there, that it was a real sort of going down. And so I'm saying, well, just to come back to the question that someone said earlier, is that it does, it gives you an amazing insight into yourself. And that slowly dawned on me. But that initial feeling, there was like a meltdown in that moment, wasn't there, when I'd really gone down. And I remember we went into a cafe, I can't remember what it was, but I ended up walking back and
there was
back home completely out of it.
Did not know. I mean, David takes ages to cross a road. He will stand at the side of a road forever, and he just ran across this road, totally no regard for the traffic, and walked quite a long way. We were quite a long way from home, got all the way home without even knowing, really.
I hardly remember that. I just remember that I was doing it. Yeah. And I think that's shock.
Yeah,
that sense of shock. Yeah. And that feeling of being out of control, that feeling of losing it. What have I opened? And yeah, but having got through that, I'd already got books about autism, and I began to look at them. And I remembered things from school. I remembered things from university, from from work, from our relationship. And they began, even just that evening, began falling into place. So I think that is, and then that really, so having done that dip, it was like there was that initial dip, and then there was a big rise. There was a big sort of, oh, that's why. And I think it was just this having to know, because I could have thought this before. I got the books before, but having had that experience of somebody saying this is a very clear case of, began looking, saying, oh, that's why I felt those, the problems with socializing, of having to really force myself to go, hello, I'm David, and finding that really difficult, and then go, what on earth do I say next? And that being a challenge to me, and I'm going, oh, that just makes a lot of sense. It's not that I'm unusual for who I am. So suddenly that loss of identity really formed a new identity, really began that journey into me and understanding myself in a way that I hadn't done before. And it was like all those strange conversations that I'd had, those misunderstandings I'd had, I remembered them. So, there's something about growing up undiagnosed. As I said right at the beginning, I felt special, I felt different, and yet I felt I had, did have some, major challenges in socializing, and yet really deep thinking and challenges in the practicality of work. I loved studying at university. When I got into the practicalities of work, I found that a lot more challenging and exhausting. And so it began to make sense. And the conversations I'd had with people, the relationships I'd had with people, that being bullied at school, not wanting to do PE at school because I found that difficult. And that wasn't just because I wasn't physically fit. That was due partly to a lack of coordination, which again links with autism. It's also part of just part of working together as a team. I couldn't do I struggled with the teamwork and things like that. And so it began to make sense. And I was going, this makes so much sense, why. And I wish someone told me how to write essays when I was at university. And, if you give me a template, I could have just got a really good template. I could have just followed that easily. But because whenever there was that lack of structure, I'd struggled. Different sorts of challenges I'd had. And the different sorts of, which are different to what other people had. So I'd found some things really easy that people find difficult, and some things really difficult that other people had found really, really easy. Some of the practical things, practical things in the house, practical things in relationships, and in getting on with people at work, getting on with people socially. So, that emotion was really, there were tears in finding myself. There was tears in going, yeah, this is me. This makes sense of so much. I was finding myself in a new way, and realized how unrealistic I'd lived for a long time as well. And I think I've become a little bit more grounded in that. I'm not quite sure how to express that, but there's a sense of being very theoretical, though I am still very theoretical. The practicalities of doing things I really hated, and realizing that that was connected with being autistic, and that was, but I could become, I mean, this insight, I think, helped me a bit become grounded. Does that make sense, Nets? Is that?
So the final question here is what support did you get afterwards, specifically asking about employment and whether employers are more understanding of social differences after somebody's received a formal diagnosis?
Yeah. I took a redundancy from my teaching roughly a similar time to my, not long after my diagnosis. So but I had been equality and diversity rep with the college, which was really interesting that I would, have a desire to do that. I knew I was different, and I think that was part of it. And I think I applied for that maybe when I was thinking I was, going towards the diagnosis for that. So I think so you're asking about post-diagnostic support. The biggest post-diagnostic support I had was my own reading. Was reading the different books about that. The thing I was recommended to was a discussion group, an adult discussion group with Autism West Midlands, and that was really helpful. Certainly initially, we discussed a number of different issues together as peers that were all related to autism, and so all of this was helping me get an insight into myself. All of this was getting me to reflect on my own life and my own behavior now and my own thoughts now and what have this impacted me. And so that was really helpful to have that discussion group. That discussion group went to, was it about a year? But after a time, feel like you're outgrown it because the same topics came up again. So it's very useful initially, or it can be if you're just beginning to think about these things, and you can put questions. What we did is we sat around in a circle, we put in different questions into a hat, pulled out a question and talked about that for half an hour, and then pulled out another one and kept doing that. So it wasn't an expert teaching us anything, it was us discussing and reflecting on different questions that were related in some way to Asperger's autism diagnosis. And so that was helpful as far as that went. One of the things that is noticeable in my looking through my diagnosis is it said, I will not be asking, I will not be making another appointment with Mr. Derbyshire. So psychiatrist, there was no follow-up from the psychiatrist. There was not, now we're going to give you both diagnostic support and we're going to teach you about this or help you or give you any therapy that will deal with this. It was like, I've recommended Autism West Midlands, so I've recommended a local organisation, and thank you very much. This is my, that was not in a nasty way, but that was the end of the psychiatrist's responsibility.
Do you think, can I just ask a question there?
Yeah.
Do you think that might be because the psychiatrist and maybe even the GP thought were then leaving it to Autism West Midlands to forward you on to any other support channels that may be available?
Yeah, I think, yeah. And there is very little for someone that is, how shall I say, that's able and coping with life to the degree I was coping with life, and received a very late diagnosis. There is very little support out there. That you know, if someone, you know, there was some support in that people could get someone to go into their workplace and give some awareness and give some advice on things like that. But none of the things were really, you know, I talked to one or two people through Autism West Midlands, and for me, I can find the best resource they had that was suitable for me was the adult discussion group. I think it was an adult social group as well, but I didn't find that helpful. It was talking about these issues that were important to me. So, and so there wasn't other support. The other support that I received in post-diagnostic support is the fact that comes from the fact that I applied to do a master's, a master's degree. And so I was able to apply for disabled student allowance. And that gave me not only some software, this is Dragon and things like that, but it also gave me a mind mapping software, also gave me access to a study skills mentor and a general mentor and a study skills mentor for the 3 years I was working part-time on a master's for 3 years. And during that time I had access to those. So that was another support, but that came because I was a student during that time. So that was the other support that I got. I think I found other things like the autism show and talks from various things that the autism show organized, and went to events and listened to different lectures on aspects. What I found best in the autism show was the fellow autistic people presenting their experiences and their insights, rather than the professionals that worked with autistic people that weren't themselves autistic, though they had some insights as well. And it was worthwhile seeing some of those. I think it's something about the medical model that says, you know, this is a deficit. Whereas when you talk to the people that are autistic, they say, actually, it's not just a deficit, and this is quite important realization, that there are lots of strengths that come with autism. There's a strength in perseverance, there's a strength in hyper-focusing, there's a strength in sensitivity that you can, and you can play to those strengths and use those strengths in your life. And realizing that was probably a big step for me. That and a big step in that I got the insight, but it wasn't just the insight of the deficits. Once I saw that from the autistic community, from other autistic people, that they were saying there were strengths, I thought, wow, it's not just now I understand all the problems I've had and why that's the case. It's understanding also that I've had these strengths and giving me insight into these strengths that was very important. There probably could have been, over the time that I'd lived undiagnosed, a number of interventions that I could have benefited from, but that didn't happen. You know, there could have been ways in which I could have been supported. I'm sure there were ways in which I could have been supported at work, and reasonable adjustments in getting, you know, clearer information, to work in quieter environments, maybe. I always found teaching adults much easier than teaching younger people, for example, and maybe could have been used to my better skills. I think, and to be honest, I think some of the best, how can I say this? The best support I've received is from books, my own reading and my own reflection. And I think one of the reasons I set up Asperger's Heroes, so I say it slightly tongue-in-cheek, is for my own therapy. In that what we've done in Asperger's Heroes, particularly in doing these workshops over the last couple of years, helps me express part of when I do something, it helps me. And when other guest speakers come in, I'm learning and gaining in that. So I've actually, out of that experience of there not being something, I coached and mentored some people individually and supported them sometimes through that diagnostic process. And in all that, there's a lot of reflection on my own experiences. I read and read and read. And then I just got to a point where I just sort of sat and reflected on those experiences myself, and that was a really helpful experience. Now, as long as those reflections don't take you down and say, oh, isn't this terrible? Isn't this, I can't really cope. Is my life worth living? All those sort of things. If you're going down and down and down, it's not helpful. But I was able to reflect on them positively. Learn, I understood the importance of positivity, the importance of gratitude, and so on in doing that. And that was really that sort of insight, and gaining more and more insights as I grow and helping other people grow has helped me. The training in awareness, understanding, and inclusion by for employers, for other services that we might interact with, is really important, so that people know how to be inclusive of people that are neurodiverse in different ways. But also what I would have personally, looking back, is quite interesting. I think what I would have personally liked would have been a one-to-one mentoring with someone to talk about all these issues that my reading and my the things I'd heard from different talks, and understanding how my diagnosis explained me in the past and what I could do now, and what strategies I could put into place in relating to people, initially certainly in relating to nets and so on. That sort of one-to-one mentoring is something I would have appreciated. Though I got the discussion group, it wasn't really, it didn't go to the level that I would have liked it. So what I found is I was doing that for myself. I was working these things out myself, and then I was doing them for other people and helping other people. And I think I got the, what helped me was helping other people in that.
And I think we're there. I think we've lost David.